The morning light over the Lamont property is deceptively calm. A wide stretch of earth lies silent beneath the wind, the same land that for months carried the weight of unanswered questions. And now, something's changed. A construction crew working near the western boundary unearthed what appears to be an old drainage ditch, one that was overlooked during the original search for little Gus Lamont. The soil is compacted in strange layers. The shape of the trench doesn't match old property maps. And for investigators, it's not what's inside that's immediately haunting. It's the realization that no one ever looked here before. For a case that's divided a community, fractured a family, and haunted investigators for over a year, this ditch may finally be speaking.
But the question that now ripples through everyone who's followed this case is simple. If this ditch has been here all along, how did everyone miss it? Before we begin, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Shadow Detective. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what you think might really be buried beneath the surface of this case. The story of Gus Lamont begins in the vast, unforgiving expanse of rural South Australia, a region defined by heat, silence, and distance. The Lamont property stretches for miles, a sheep and cattle station surrounded by sparse vegetation, dry creeks, and dirt tracks that seem to lead nowhere. It was here, in the heart of isolation, that 4-year-old Gus Lamont was last seen. A bright, curious boy, small enough to still stumble over his boots, but old enough to explore the family's property with fascination. On that October afternoon, the air was still, the horizon blurring in a shimmer of heat. According to reports, Gus had been playing near a sand heap, just a short walk from the farmhouse, while his grandmother and mother worked nearby. And then, silence. Minutes turned into hours. Searchers combed the property, calling his name. Helicopters circled overhead. Police, volunteers, and local farmers scoured every inch of the rugged terrain, and yet, no sign of Gus. From that moment, the Lamont property became both a home and a haunting. The case quickly captured national attention. The media descended, drawn by the mystery and the family's stoic silence. Police announced that the search would continue for as long as it takes. But as days turned into weeks, questions began to surface, not just about where Gus went, but about what really happened that day on the Lamont property. The family's relationship with the press grew tense. An incident in which Gus's grandmother, Josie, was photographed holding a firearm only deepened public scrutiny. The police later clarified she'd been attempting to kill a snake, not threaten anyone. But the image, frozen in time, told a different story. And then came the quiet. Weeks without a word. No press conferences, no updates, no visible emotion. Just an empty homestead and a missing boy. Now, with this newly discovered ditch only 600 meters from the original search zone, the story that once seemed buried under dust and time has begun to shift again. Because if this trench really predates the investigation, if it was part of the property's infrastructure, why didn't anyone mention it? And if it was dug after Gus vanished, who dug it and why? From the very beginning, the investigation into Gus Lamont's disappearance was intense, methodical, and yet, somehow, incomplete. Police arrived at the Lamont property within hours. Drones, helicopters, and ground search teams began sweeping the surrounding terrain, a patchwork of open paddocks, dense scrub, and dirt tracks that twisted like scars through the landscape. For days, the focus was on a 5-kilometer radius around the farmhouse. Every shed, dam, and outbuilding was searched. Every vehicle was inspected. At its peak, more than 100 people joined the effort. Police officers, state emergency volunteers, and neighbors from nearby stations. They searched on foot, on horseback, with dogs. They drained a private dam holding nearly 3 million liters of water just to be certain that Gus hadn't wandered too close and fallen in. But despite the scale, something about the search felt strangely narrow. Because while authorities meticulously combed the areas nearest the farmhouse, there were parts of the property that remained largely unexamined. Shallow ditches, machinery trenches, and older infrastructure zones that had fallen out of use. It was in one of these areas, more than half a kilometer from the main homestead, where new evidence has recently emerged. A ditch. Long, narrow, and oddly placed. At first glance, it looks unremarkable, another part of rural property management. But satellite imagery, along with local reports, suggests it may have appeared after the initial search efforts concluded, not during. And that subtle timing, the space between the official search and the ditch's appearance, may hold the most haunting clue yet. Authorities at the time were adamant. There were no signs of foul play, no evidence that Gus had been abducted, no indication of an accident beyond the boundaries of the property. But as the days passed, inconsistencies began to appear in the narrative. Neighbors reported hearing conflicting accounts of when Gus was last seen. Some said he'd been playing outside alone. Others claimed he was with family members near the shed. Still others recalled that his mother and grandfather were away from the main house that day, attending to livestock. In a landscape this vast, those small contradictions matter. Because when time and terrain blur, truth becomes fragile. Police eventually declared the disappearance a missing persons case, not a crime scene. They released updates to reassure the public, emphasizing the thoroughness of the search. But as the weeks stretched on, investigators began privately questioning whether something critical had been overlooked. There were whispers, quiet, cautious, about the psychology of silence within the family, about how little the parents spoke publicly, about how the grandmother's temper had flared so visibly on camera. And yet the biggest silence of all wasn't emotional, it was physical. Because no one ever mentioned the ditch. No one ever asked why, after months of search efforts, a section of the property so close, only 600 meters from the house, remained unexamined. Was it simply an oversight? A blind spot in a massive, chaotic operation? Or was it something deliberately ignored, something hidden in plain sight? By the time police moved on to other leads, the media cycle had slowed. Interest faded. The story of Gus Lamont became another open-ended mystery in a country vast enough to swallow its secrets whole. But now, with satellite data revealing subtle Earth movements and locals pointing to the unexplained ditch, the investigation may finally be circling back, not toward something new, but toward what was missed all along. Because sometimes, in true crime, the answers don't lie in what was found. They lie in what was left behind. When a child goes missing, investigators often study not just the evidence, but the silences between words, the patterns in behavior, the subtle inconsistencies that can whisper truths no one dares to say aloud. In the Lamont case, the family's dynamic became a focal point almost immediately. Not because anyone was accused, but because the emotional temperature inside that house seemed uneven. Gus's grandmother was the last confirmed person to see him alive. Witnesses described her as deeply protective of the boy, almost possessive in her care. She was the one who called out his name first, who, after minutes of silence, began to panic. But some search volunteers later remarked that her panic seemed to arrive late, that crucial minutes passed between realization and reaction. Then there was the argument, one that few outside the family knew about at first, a heated exchange between Gus's father and grandmother in the days following the disappearance. Police took statements, but the details were kept quiet. What was said and why it mattered remains unclear. Yet those who were close to the family recalled tension, the kind that doesn't start overnight. Gus's father, by contrast, appeared withdrawn during press briefings. His words were calm, his eyes often fixed downward. Some described it as grief, others as detachment. But in truth, grief takes many forms. Silence is one of them. His mother, though seldom interviewed, was described by locals as shattered. She avoided the media entirely, and when she did appear in public, it was usually behind sunglasses, silent, holding a small photo of Gus in her hands. None of this, on its own, points to guilt or deception. But it does raise questions about communication, and what was, or wasn't, shared in those first vital hours. In missing child cases, psychologists often stress a crucial rule. The first narrative matters most. The words spoken in the first 24 hours often shape the trajectory of the entire investigation. And in the Lamont case, that initial narrative had small but telling fractures. The grandmother's description of events slightly shifted in later interviews. At first, she said Gus was playing near the sandpit, just by the fence. Later, it became closer to the gate. And then, not far from the front yard. Each version added a few meters, a widening gap in geography and memory. Meanwhile, neighbors recalled seeing multiple vehicles moving along the western access road that day, a road that cuts past the boundary of the Lamont property and leads toward the direction of the now infamous ditch. None of these sightings were corroborated or linked to the family, but the lack of follow-up only deepened public suspicion. The community's response to the Lamonts was divided. Some defended them fiercely, insisting that they were good, private people caught in tragedy. Others admitted unease, not over anything overt, but over what one neighbor called the quiet that came too soon. In most rural disappearances, grief is loud, wailing, searching, shouting into the wind. But at the Lamont property, the tone changed quickly. The media stopped being invited. The family drew inward. The front gate stayed closed. Detectives noted this, but didn't press the issue. Without concrete evidence, emotion alone can't be a case file. Yet in hindsight, this withdrawal created an informational vacuum, one that rumor, speculation, and online theories eagerly filled. Even former detective Gary Jubilin, who later reviewed the case, remarked that family behavior is often misunderstood in trauma. But in rare cases, it's also where the truth begins to leak through. He wasn't implying guilt. He was pointing to the complexity of human response, that grief, shock, fear, and even self-protection can all look the same on the surface. But beneath it, something else may be stirring, knowledge, withheld or forgotten. As the months passed, the Lamont family grew increasingly isolated. Some relatives moved away. The property, once full of livestock and motion, grew quiet. Visitors described the air around the house as stuck, heavy, unmoving. And somewhere out there, just beyond that silent fence line, the ditch waited, unseen, unsearched, and unspoken. Because perhaps the real question isn't how Gus vanished. It's why no one ever looked closer at the one place that could still speak. Every mystery echoes another. And the disappearance of Gus Lamont, with its silence, its contradictions, and its vanishing trail, finds unsettling parallels in a handful of other missing child cases, both in Australia and abroad. One of the most haunting comparisons is the case of William Tyrrell, a 3-year-old who disappeared from the quiet town of Kendal, New South Wales, in 2014. Like Gus, William was playing just meters from trusted adults when he vanished. There were no screams, no witnesses, no signs of struggle, only the sudden, impossible quiet that seems to swallow small children whole. In William's case, searchers faced the same contradictions: vast land, little evidence, and a timeline that refused to make sense. Despite hundreds of officers, volunteers, and advanced technology, nothing was found in those first crucial days. Later, attention shifted inward, toward family, foster relationships, and minor inconsistencies that, while human, were magnified under the microscope of suspicion. Gary Jubilin, the same detective who later commented on the Lamont case, led that search too. His takeaway after decades of such investigations was stark. When a child disappears in silence, either nature concealed them perfectly, or someone helped that silence stay quiet. That quote lingers because it mirrors the Lamont investigation too closely to ignore. Then there's the Cleo Smith case in Western Australia, one that began with a similar tone of despair, but ended in a rare miracle. Cleo, aged 4, vanished overnight from her family's tent at a remote campsite. The search was frantic, sprawling, desperate, and yet, weeks later, she was found alive, hidden in a locked room less than an hour away. What united both Cleo's and Gus's cases wasn't just geography, but psychology. In both, the assumption that a child had wandered off delayed the possibility of immediate abduction response. It's an understandable instinct to believe in accident before intent. But as experts have noted, that instinct can cost time, and in missing child cases, time is oxygen. In Gus Lamont's case, the delay between the last confirmed sighting and the first emergency call, roughly 3 hours, mirrors this dangerous window. It's not an accusation. It's a statistical reality. Those first hours decide whether a case becomes a rescue or a recovery. Internationally, cases like Madeleine McCann in Portugal reveal the same haunting architecture of uncertainty: a vanished child, no physical evidence, and a family narrative torn apart by scrutiny and speculation. In each case, the search expanded outward until it reached the same question: what if the answer never left the starting point? Forensic specialists often call this the circle principle. The idea that, in unexplained disappearances, the point of origin is not just where the case begins, but often where it ends. The first scene, the first version of events, the first overlooked area, those are the coordinates where truth tends to wait. And that's why the Lamont ditch, once dismissed as unimportant, has become the quiet obsession of analysts and armchair detectives alike. Because history has shown that what's ignored early often returns later, not as new evidence, but as an old regret. From the fields of Kendall to the scrublands of Yanta, from Portugal to Western Australia, these cases carry the same refrain. A child disappears, evidence evaporates, and silence becomes the loudest witness. What makes the Lamont case unique, however, is its precision, the sheer lack of error in its mystery. No conflicting footprints, no misplaced objects, no known witnesses. It's the cleanest chaos a detective can face. And perhaps that's why it resonates so deeply with both investigators and the public. Because when a mystery is too quiet, too neat, it begins to feel less like confusion and more like concealment. As one behavioral analyst once said, "The absence of chaos can sometimes be the biggest red flag of all." So what do these echoes teach us? That every unsolved case carries a twin, a mirror in which it hides. And sometimes looking into that mirror is what finally breaks the silence. Every cold case eventually reaches a crossroads, a place where fact and theory blur, and investigators must decide whether to keep searching the same ground or start questioning the ground itself. For Gus Lamont's disappearance, that crossroads centers around one simple but haunting question. What if the answer was always right there, just buried beneath what everyone assumed was nothing? The official position has long leaned toward the wandering child theory, that Gus, perhaps distracted or chasing something that caught his eye, simply strayed too far. It's a narrative that comforts the mind because it keeps the darkness at bay. But when logic is applied, that theory bends under the weight of detail. Experts in lost person behavior note that children under 5 rarely travel more than 500 meters from their last known point. Gus's search area spanned over 6 kilometers in every direction, terrain so vast and open that any movement should have left a trace. Yet there were none. No prints, no scent, no signs of distress, nothing. Some investigators began to whisper about interference, not foul play necessarily, but error. A rushed grid search, incomplete mapping, or assumptions about terrain coverage that created blind spots. The ditch theory, as it's quietly called now, emerged from that uncertainty. Drones scanning the Lamont property months later picked up subtle depressions in the soil. Irregular formations near the western boundary where erosion had shifted the landscape. These were areas previously logged as searched, but the data now showed inconsistencies. Could something or someone have been missed there? It's a question that divides even the experts. Some believe the ditch was irrelevant, a natural feature exaggerated by rumor. Others see it as the single most important clue left untested, a physical metaphor for the case itself. Shallow, dismissed, but possibly concealing something deeper. Forensic geologists consulted on similar cases note, that in semi-arid terrain, the soil composition can change drastically after rainfall, revealing hidden indentations, compacted earth, or decomposed material that wasn't detectable before. So when analysts say the ditch changed shape, it may not be poetic. It might be literal. But beyond the dirt and data lies the human layer, the psychology of silence. Some family observers and behavioral experts point to micro-behaviors during interviews, pauses, avoided eye contact, emotional dissonance. Yet to any trained criminologist, grief itself can mimic guilt. Shock can resemble indifference. Trauma often looks suspicious when viewed through a forensic lens. So, was the family hiding something, or simply surviving the unbearable? Theories splinter here, branching in two directions. One side sees the Lamont case as a tragic accident, buried beneath time, oversight, and impossible terrain. The other sees a puzzle, an orchestrated disappearance wrapped in familiarity, where the lack of evidence isn't coincidence but design. And between them lies the one fact no one disputes, that the land remembers what people forget. When investigators return to a scene after years, they aren't just revisiting geography, they're confronting memory itself. Soil shifts, trees grow, people move on. But the ground, in its quiet way, keeps the imprint of what happened. If Gus Lamont's story is ever solved, it won't come from confession or theory. It will come from patience, the kind that sifts dust and listens to silence until it speaks. Gary Jubilin once said, "In the end, the truth doesn't hide, it waits." And maybe that's what the ditch is doing, waiting for the right eyes, the right technology, the right moment. Because in cases like this, truth isn't lost, it's just layered. The Gus Lamont case remains officially unsolved, a file that sits between missing and unanswered. But for those who've studied it, for those who've walked that uneven ground and stood at the edge of the ditch, there's a lingering sense that this story isn't finished. It's paused. Every disappearance leaves two absences, one physical, one psychological. The first is visible, a child gone, a search map, a family portrait now incomplete. The second is quieter, the fracture that runs through those left behind, reshaping every memory before and after the moment of loss. For Grandma Josie, for Gus's parents, and for the community that searched until their boots tore, the pain is generational now. Time didn't close the wound. It simply taught them how to walk around it. But the ditch, that forgotten strip of land no one wanted to think about, keeps calling people back. Some visit it as pilgrims, others as skeptics. Every gust of wind that brushes its dry grass feels like a whisper from a story that still wants to be told. There's a theory among forensic anthropologists that the earth holds emotional residue, that every disturbed patch of soil carries a kind of memory. It's unscientific, but strangely poetic, that somewhere beneath the silence, truth still breathes. Maybe that's why the Lamont case still haunts people who never even met Gus, because it reminds us of something deeply human, how fragile visibility is, how quickly a person can vanish, not just from the world, but from the narrative built to find them. And maybe the real ditch isn't made of soil or stone. Maybe it's the one we dig in our minds when answers become too uncomfortable to face. The one filled with doubt, regret, and the quiet hope that someday, something, or someone will surface. If new evidence does emerge, if technology, persistence, or simple chance brings clarity, it won't just rewrite the case file, it will restore a fragment of truth to a story suspended in the dark. Until then, Gus remains both everywhere and nowhere, a name carried by wind, a shadow in family photos, a mystery that asks us to keep looking, even when the world has stopped paying attention. Because maybe the truth didn't disappear that day. Maybe it was buried, waiting for someone patient enough to look again. Thank you for watching. Stay curious. Stay compassionate.